Welcome back to Math 104. We've already computed the exam score cutoff for an A. That was 74 plus 0.9 copies of our measuring stick. And the exam cutoff for a B, the lower cutoff. That was the mean plus 0.25 copies of our measuring stick. We've now been asked to find the range of scores corresponding to a C. To find the range of scores corresponding to a C, first notice that the upper boundary for a C equals the lower boundary for a B, and that's 76.075. Furthermore, and this is what's new, the lower boundary for a C equals the upper boundary for a D. In standard deviations, that was at 0.75 standard deviations below the mean, so we compute 74 minus 0.75 copies of our measuring stick, and that brings us down to 67.775. Thus, our range of exam scores for a C is between 67.775 and 76.075. To find what percentage of the class receives a C, we really must work with z-scores. The upper boundary, measured in z's, measured in standard deviations, is positive 0.25, and the lower boundary measured in standard deviations is negative 0.75. So we're going to have to do two separate lookups in the table, which will tell us about first this region here, this sliver to the right of the mean, and then separately this region to the left of the mean. When we look up z equals 0.25, we find a probability of 0.0987. That corresponds to this region just to the right of the mean. That means, as a result of this lookup in the table, that 9.87% of the class is getting a B, and those are the ones who were above the mean. When we look up z equals negative 0.75 in the table, we obtain 0.2734, which means that another 27.34% of the class, in addition to this 9.87%, also received a C. In total, 9.87% plus 27.34% gives us 37.21% of the class that receives a C. Here's another way that grading on the curve could be done in the more traditional sense of that term. Professor What's-Her-Name uses the following system for assigning letter grades, but don't worry, this is not the system used in our course. The mean final exam grade was 73, with a standard deviation of 6.5. Now what's said in advance are not specifically the standard deviations above or below the mean that represent cutoffs between grade levels, but rather what percentage of the class will receive each letter grade. Given this information, it's reasonable to ask, what are the exam grade cutoffs for each of the letter grades? Again, don't panic, this is not the system used in our course. I have not decided in advance that so many will get A's and so many will get B's, etc. Now, how do we approach this? We are told that the top 22% of the class receives an A. This is actually similar to problems we have already done. The idea is to look for 0.28 as an entry in the table, not 0.22. That's because there's going to be a cutoff someplace, a certain number of standard deviations above the mean, such that 0.22 will be the probability of falling above that line, leaving 0.28 as the probability of falling between the mean and the cutoff for an A. When we look up 0.28 in the table, we find that the z we are looking for is 0.77. The cutoff for an A is 0.77 standard deviations above the mean. So in points, as an exam score, the cutoff for an A is 73, that's the mean, plus 0.77 measuring sticks. That works out to 78.005. The next 24% of the class receives a B. Now the top 22% have already been accounted for. The next 24% down are in a region from the cutoff for an A moving downwards and ending at some score Z, some number of standard deviations Z that is still above the mean. How do I know that this Z, this lower cutoff for a B, is above the mean? Because the A's, together with the B's, account for 46% of the class. That's still a little bit less than half the class. So the cutoff for a Z is going to be a little bit above the mean. In particular, the cutoff z-score for a B excludes 4% of the class that's just above the mean. The A's and the B's together account for 46%. That leaves 4% before we get down to the mean. When we go to the table and look inside the table for 0.04, we come up with z equals 0.10. Thus, the cutoff exam score for a B is 73, the mean, plus 0.1 measuring sticks, and that's 73.65, really just a tiny bit above the mean. Before going on to the next video, find the exam grade cutoffs for a C and a D. What we already know is that the B range ends 0.1 standard deviations above the mean, and that 4% of the class scored above the mean but didn't get a B. We are told that 30% of the class receives a C, and the next 15% of the class below that receives a D.